Hi, and welcome back. This is Senior English B, and today we are going to spend some time introducing the third of the Generation 2 Romantic poets. The first was Byron, good. The second was Shelley, good. The third one now will be Keats, right. Now, you'll, of course, remember that our Generation 1 poets, those old farts, as we sometimes refer to them, of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Blake and Burns and some of those guys, we're now turning to the third of our poets. And biography here, more than any other poet, is really going to matter. The first thing I suggest that you write down on page 881 are his dates. And then I'll ask you to do some quick mathematics. And I'll ask you to take a look at the very first line of the biography on 881 to realize that Keats dies at 25 years old. Right? In other words, think of it this way. Keats dies, for most of you, 6 years from now. Okay? So that's pretty remarkable if you'll just think about that. 6 years from now, most of you will be, if you haven't finished university, at the very end of your university experience. A lot will depend, of course, on the degree that you take, etc., right? In other words, think of it this way. What if I told you that by the time you graduated from college or university, two things. One, you'd be dead. Two, you would have created good enough stuff to be recognized years and years later in some kind of book. About that you would say, wow, well that would mean, because for most of us we haven't started creating anything of importance yet in our life, that the next 6 years for you would be monumental if you're going to create something that has some longevity after you're dead. Although your hymnal doesn't, I don't know why, although your hymnal doesn't give this information, I'm going to begin with Keats's death in 1821. Before he died, he said, I want these words on my tombstone. His tombstone is in Rome because he died in Rome, for reasons I'll explain in a second. But let's start with his tombstone words because it's fascinating. He asked for these words to be put on his own tombstone, and the words are these. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. If it was me, I'd write that down and then look at the words I just wrote down. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Right, writ, short for written, correct? Here lies one whose name was writ in water. That was his request, be put on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Dude, what is up with a statement like that to be put on your tombstone? I mean, for example, right now I could jump to 3A and ask you, if for a reason that was fairly accurate, let's say, for example, last night you were sitting in a hospital room. This happened in the world somewhere last night, right? And somebody your age is sitting in the room and the doctor came in and said to you, by Monday it's done. You're going to be done. That's it. So basically you got about 72 hours and it's going to be over for you. And you're going to move in and out of consciousness, so you better get your house in order. You know that conversation. And then somebody were to come to you, maybe somebody that loved you deeply, and said, we want to resurrect some kind of a tombstone over your grave. What would you like on there? What words would you like on there? Some of you will say, that is a morbid thought to even think about at our age. And you would be right, wouldn't you? Most kids your age don't think about what words they want on their tombstone because they assume they got a few more years to live. Right? Would you agree with me? But what if for reals, the doctor said it's probably done by Monday, what would you have for the words that could kind of represent your life? Some of you might say, I don't want any words. Some of you might say, I don't care, you choose. Some of you might say the way you think about the quote that you have to put in the annual to represent you. Give me some time and I'll start thinking. And you draw back in time to maybe something that would matter to you. Maybe a Zeus, a Dr. Seuss book or something like that, whatever it would be, some quote or something like that. Keats writes his own quote and he puts it on the tombstone as, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." Now, if you walk up to a swimming pool with a stick and you make a mark in the water of the pool, what happens to the mark? It's gone. It's gone, right? So what does it mean to say, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water"? What does that even mean?
It disappears.
Right. Say it out loud, Kroger. It means what? He was thoroughly convinced at the age of 25 that no one will ever remember me. I am a loser because I got to die so young. Now, what's up with this dying young stuff? Well, can we say this out loud? In England of Keats's day, roughly 1800, we're still working with that same date, right? They heat their houses with straight black coal. They do all their cooking with coal. We're talking about thousands of people who live in the city of London. Coal. Everybody burns with coal. London kind of sits down in a declivity anyway, and coal, as you know, really black smoke. In fact, we're told there are times of the year when the coal smoke is so thick, they have to light the lanterns so that people can know where they're going by daytime. In the middle of the day, you can't see the sun. All that stuff gets breathed in. So one of the more, can I say it this way, popular illnesses would happen this way. One afternoon, you'd start coughing. All of a sudden, blood would come up. Blood would come up. By the way, if you've ever seen in movies of this time period, they almost always are carrying a hanky. The reason they're carrying a hanky is, one of the reasons is this. You cover your mouth. The minute you see spotted blood on your hanky, you know you've got what we call today tuberculosis, what they call consumption. It's an attack of the lungs. An attack of the lungs. It's an infection of the lungs. And we believe, by and large, a lot of it was created by the wretched air that they all breathe. And TB, or consumption, is something seems to be inherited. It runs in families. In other words, if your little brother had it or your older sister had it, chances are really good you probably will have it too. And once you start coughing up blood, this is important for your notes, it's done. It's over. It's not like they can give you some medicine that's going to take this thing away. The only hope possible is to try to flee the wretched air and go some other place. And for the day, one of the places that people thought maybe was better was to go to the better air on the Mediterranean Ocean. And still today it is true that Italy boasts some of the greatest weather, certain parts of Italy especially. So Keats, now we'll get to his storyline. Keats loses people he loves in his family to consumption. They start coughing blood. He's watched, for example, his bro go. He knows what this is like. So when Keats starts coughing blood, he knows it's done. He realizes it's over. It's literally like you going into the doctor and the doctor saying to you, "We found some stuff, it's done, it's over." One of the things that makes lecturing Keats so interesting and compelling to me is that many, many years ago when I came to Worland High School, I was told about a young student who was a junior about to be a senior who I would be teaching. This student was a remarkable athlete. She was a volleyball player of some renown, already being recruited by Division I programs to play volleyball. They said about her that when she spiked the volleyball, it sounded like a gun went off in the commons area if the doors were open. She hit the ball so hard. Tremendously gifted athlete. And they told about this athlete in her past. The reason being, in the summer between her junior and her senior year, she had a bruise on her leg. And she went into the doctor, and they said, "That's kind of strange that that bruise isn't getting better." And they did some tests, and they found out that, in fact, that bruise was cancer in her bone. And in one afternoon, she was diagnosed with this disease, and they took her leg off to save her life. Gone. So here's this incredibly gifted athlete who then all of a sudden is told, yeah, Stanford, no go. Sorry, now we're just talking about whether you're going to make it through the end of your senior year. By the time I met her, no hair because of the chemotherapy. She was on crutches because she had to have that to walk. And she was thinner. She was starting to already shrink because, of course, she was no longer doing the things she loved. And yet, she said, no matter what, I'm graduating from high school. Everyone was like, okay, honey, but we don't know. She's like, no, I am. And she really did try, and she came to my lectures, but by the end of the senior year, she couldn't come to school anymore. She was too weakened, and so I ended up having to actually, because I was her teacher, I was lecturing many of the afternoons just to her in her house. When we got to Keats, well, think about this for a moment. Here's a cat who dies at 25, and he knows he's going. And I'm supposed to teach this stuff to a student whose picture, by the way, is, of course, on our walls, right? Young Sheaf was an amazingly gifted athlete in person, by all accounts. I never really got to know her for very long, but the people who are closest to her said, quite remarkable. Her funeral was so well attended that there was not enough seats anywhere inside of the church, the large church on Main Street, and there were people sitting outside on the green with large speakers outside so they could at least hear what was going on inside. She was extremely well loved. And yet, how do you teach about a guy who started coughing up blood at the age of 23 and knew he was going to die? It was just a matter of time. Keats will respond to that moment with a famous sonnet, when I have fears that I may cease to be. Now you understand what that line means. Before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. This is the lines that you'll be committing to memory. The thing that's fascinating about Keats now to finish is before he dies in Rome, and he's working on a poem the night before he goes. He actually is editing a poem and writing poetry the night before he dies in bed. But he writes the words on his tombstone, here lies one whose name is written in water, because Keats is worried. Well, what's that all about? Well, let's put it in our notes this way. Keats always has bad health. He's not a strong kid. He's a weak kid, physically. And so coming through school, when the other kids get to go outside and play soccer or rugby, or of course the sport of their day, cricket, kind of like our baseball game, he has to stay inside. And this pictures of him in our mind's eye of stuck in the library, which is where they put him. And he's looking through the window out onto the green, the playground, where the other kids get to go outside and play and run and have a good time. Keats can't go out there. He's stuck inside in a library. He learns how to do the only thing he's left to do, and that is read. And he's a voracious reader. He's the kind of guy that can sit down and read hours at a time and never even get up. It's his escape, you might say at first, and then it becomes his passion. Along with that, are you ready for this for your notes? Keats genuinely believes that the most important people who ever live are poets. People who write poetry. Now this is of course laughable to us today because we don't really think about poets as being very important. If you don't believe me, go home this evening and say to your mom, your dad, whoever you live with that you're responsible to, hey, after a lecture by the loony today, I've decided I know what I'm going to major in college. Oh, great. What's it going to be? I'm going to major in poetry. And then just watch their face. I dare you to do this just to get a sense. Say, I'm going to major in poetry, and then just watch their face. And of course, they'll do one of these numbers. Oh, good, okay. So, what's the first question that's going to come from this observation by them? Well, what do you... Yeah, what, do you get paid to write poems? No. Nobody even reads poetry anymore. Oh... So you're going to do 4 years of college? No, I'll probably do 5, and then after that I'll have to do 4 more, and just because I'm going to have to probably teach it as well. That means a PhD. So I'm going to be in debt a lot. Oh, so like, are you going to do like something else too? Like maybe engineering degree along with it? No. I told you, all I want to be is a poet. Watch it. Just go ahead, watch it. in Keats's day, it was already starting to happen that people were beginning to kind of look at poetry as a second-tier thing to do. But for Keats, because of his love of writers like Homer, he believed that the greatest people who ever lived were the people who wrote the poems. And by extension, of course, the stories. One of his greatest arguments was, what's the book that's found in every hotel room? It ain't a manual on engineering. Right? It's a book written by poets. Right? And to that degree, the poets are the most important people. So he tries his hand at poetry. Are you ready for this? His first attempts at poetry are gunned down. You know the people today that do the thumbs up or thumbs down for movies? Those people of his day, thumbs up, thumbs down of poems, and he wrote his first poetry and said, and they all said bad. In fact, there was a review that said when Keats was young, he worked in a stable shoveling horse poop because that was his only job. He came from poverty, and that's his only job. And a guy who reviewed his poetry said that he should have stuck shoveling poop because that's what he was as a poet. And it devastated Keats. It devastated him. By the time he gets ready to die, you can see your dates in 1821. By the time he gets ready to die, he is thoroughly convinced he is a failure because he has not produced any work of importance. Now I'm going to finish my introduction by saying this. Are you ready for this? If you go into any literature department today, anywhere in the world, I don't care whether it's Moscow, Sydney, Australia, or of course Chicago, anywhere, and you walk into a literary department and you say, who are the five greatest poets in the English language? Of course, number one will always be? Shakespeare. You're right, Shakespeare will always be considered number one. Milton is usually going to be right there at number two, right? Chaucer will always be there. The only romantic poet that will ever get put in that list is John Keats. He's the one. He's the one. In fact, there are people who put him as number one in the list of greatest poets in the English language. And yet, if you pick up his greatest works, volume, it's very, very small for obvious reasons. He dies at 25. Didn't have enough time to produce all the poetry that Wordsworth could produce because Wordsworth grew to be very old, or Coleridge grew to be very old, right? Byron dies young, and he produces a lot of poetry. Shelley dies young, and he produces a lot of poetry. Keats dies young, and he has this very small collection of works. And yet, not even 50 years after his death, people went back to his poetry and went, whoa, this kid was way ahead of his time. And as the 20th century dawned, Keats was already being considered one of the greatest poets of the English language. Certainly the high point of the Romantic period. And so we end our time with the Romantics talking about maybe its greatest poet, John Keats. Well, what do we want to say about Keats? Well, I mean, I'm on page 880 real quickly. Obviously, you can see that the great Greek poet Pindar is going to be important, and these odes that will be written are going to be important. We'll have as well the Horatian ode as well, the irregular ode. Keats likes to write his odes. That is to say, those like apostrophe types of poems where you write to an inanimate object. You can put it in your notes now. Considered maybe his greatest single poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, a text that we're going to have to obviously spend a little bit of time with. At the bottom of page 880, you'll see your 6 vocab words there. I recommend that you do look at those words. They are words that maybe can help you in the reading of your poetry. And preparations for the exam as well. All right, let's go to 883 now. Our hour for the rest of the time now is spent with looking at some of the sonnets of Keats. We're going to look at the first of those sonnets in your hymnal on first looking into Chapman's Homer. There's some background information, though, that you need for your annotations, or this poem's not going to make as much sense to you. Once you understand this poem, it will be for you a pretty enjoyable read, but you're not going to get it unless you have some background. Let's read together. Romantic poets such as Byron, Shelley, Keats admired the culture of ancient Greece and derived inspiration from its art and literature. That you'll need to write down right away. Your textbook says ancient Greece. What it should have said is ancient Greece and Rome. Because the Romantic poets love the literature of the Greeks and the Romans. Collectively, what we call the Greco-Roman literature. Right? Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, for example, shows his tendency to associate ideas about beauty with antiquities. What is antiquities? Stuff that's really old, right? Stuff that's really old. Such as the beautifully ordained vases that ancient Greek society produced. When Keats was 21, you want to write this down now. When Keats was 21, which makes him how much older than you? See how that works? See, for some of you, that makes Keats a really interesting poet because he is so close to your age. When Keats was 21, his friend and former schoolmate, Charles Godwin Clark, introduced him to a translation of Homer by the Elizabethan poet George Chapman. The two men spent the evening reading this book, and early the next morning, Keats presented this sonnet to Clark. Now, there's a lot of stories that surround this poem. One of them is that Clark gives Keats a copy of the Iliad, and translated by a guy named Chapman. Remember, what language does the Iliad actually first, what's it written in? What language? It's of what derivation? Yeah, it's Greek, right, it's Greek. And so it's translated into English by this guy named Chapman. Lots of people were translating the Iliad. And it's translated by this guy named Chapman, and Clark gives the book to Keats. And in one story, they start reading it that night, and then Clark leaves and comes back the next morning because he wants to know what Keats thought of it. And Keats is still in bed. But sitting on the living room table, an envelope, and on the outside of the envelope are some words that are written. This is the way this kid thinks. He writes a poem, a sonnet, about reading this volume of the Iliad. Now, let's pause for a moment and just remind ourselves. When we're talking about the Iliad, we're talking about the Troy tale. What's the Troy tale about? Do you remember? Right, you're talking, of course, about that fight at the walls of Troy. Of course, who are our great heroes in that poem? Achilles, excellent. Achilles, he fights in the end against who? Do you remember? The lead fighter for the city of Troy. For those of you that saw Brad Pitt's film Troy, you know a little bit about this whole storyline, don't you, right? And, of course, it's Hector, the great Trojan warrior, right? Okay, and all of that. So that's the story of the Iliad, right? That's the story of the Iliad. Keats reads this book, and then he sits down and he writes this poem. Let's take a look at it now. Right away at 2B, we're going to point out, this is a 14-line poem. Uh-oh, what do we call that? It is a sonnet. It is a sonnet. All right, here we go. Let's take a look at it. 883. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Now let's just point out first of all that it's kind of interesting that anybody can say, I liked the book. But it's going to be Keats, and more particularly the great John Keats, who will just jot down on the back of an envelope a set of lines that we're going to put inside of an anthology many, many years later, correct? To say, wow, this is an amazingly good sonnet. How to get into this sonnet, though? Let me help you here real quickly. One, we need to understand the concept of metaphor. Comparison. In this poem, Keats is going to say in the opening line, much have I traveled. But are you ready for this? The irony of all ironies is, Keats, unlike Byron, unlike Shelley, Keats did not travel a lot. The only place he ever ended up was Rome, and that was at the end of his life, and there he died. So, what does this mean, much have I traveled in the realms of gold? Do you got any idea what this poem is actually going to equate traveling with? Write it in your notes. Traveling, and then an equal sign. Traveling, and then an equal sign, and then what? Well, what had he done all night? He had set up all night and done what? In one sitting. What did he do? He read what? He read the entire Iliad in one night. Yeah, he read for the whole night. When he says, much have I traveled in the realms of gold, what's he saying? I've read a lot of books. So for him, reading equals traveling. Now I love this poem for students because sometimes I'm asked, dude, what's the deal with reading? Why is it that some people love to read so much? Keats is going to give you the great argument for why reading is so important. He'll start out by saying, much have I traveled in the realms of gold. By gold he means here what? I've read lots of what? Good books. If he had said realms of silver or bronze, that would be lesser grade, right? But to say I've traveled in the realms of gold means I've read great books for a long time. And many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. What does that mean? It's a poetic way to say what? Not only have I read a lot of books, but I've read books that bards or poets in fealty, faith, to Apollo, the god of the Greeks. Yeah, it's the god of truth, right? What does he mean when he says, not only have I read a lot of books, but I've read a lot of books about what? About Greek culture. In other words, I've read lots and lots of books about the culture I love, the Greek culture. Oft, short for what word? Often. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his, and this French word here is, we pronounce it as domain. You know this word today as domain. In other words, what's he say? I've been told many times about, what's deep-browed Homer? Who is Homer? Homer is who? You're right, the author, the assumed author of the text. Wait a minute, what is it that
Odyssey.
Yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Remember, Homer is attributed to have written both of those greatest of poems in our culture, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. Look what he says. I'd often been told about deep-browed Homer, right? Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Can you put it in your own words? Notice, I'm helping you learn how to write stuff in your own words. He says, I've read a lot of Homer, but I never breathed its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. In a line, does he like this translation of Chapman or no? He loves it, doesn't he? In fact, what's he say about this translation? It's the best. It's the best. He says, I've traveled a lot, which is to say what? I've read a lot. And yet this poem, this translation, is the best I've ever read. Now, there are arguments about whether Keats had read Homer before this reading with Chapman, because he did not read very well in Greek. So there's some debate about this. It seems to suggest, though, that he's read a lot in terms of Greek mythology, but he never breathed its pure, serene, till he heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Once he read Chapman, how does he feel? Now we have some similes, and they're fascinating ones. Take a look. There's two of them for your notes. So you can put simile number 1 and simile number 2. Oh, what's a simile? A comparison what? Using like or as. Look how he says he feels after he read Chapman's translation. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. The word ken here means range of knowledge, things you know. Imagine for a moment. You're looking through your telescope at the skies, right? And all of a sudden, you see something through your telescope, and it's a spot that's never been there before. And you say to your servant person who's supposed to clean the lens of the telescope, dude, I told you to clean this. I was going to study the skies tonight looking for a new planet. You need to clean the telescope lens. And the guy says, sir, I just did it. I did it 3 times like you told me to. You look back through the telescope, and then you realize it. For the first time, you are the first human to ever lay eyes on that body traveling through space for the first time. Jot down in your notes, how would you feel in that moment? You're the first one to ever see it with human eyes. Of course, we know that by 1800, optics and grinding of lenses finally allowing us to really begin to look out further and further. We think of Galileo as kind of kickstarting this project, don't we? The ability to see for the first time a new planet that swims into your ken, your range of knowledge. You get to see it for the first time. How would that make you feel? Write that down in your notes. And then how does that have anything to do with reading a good book? What does Keats say reading a good book will do for you? It does give you a certain kind of feeling of awe. Would you agree? There would be a feeling of awe and respect, but also we might say excitement, right? By the way, I've had seniors that say, dude, I've never read a book that ever makes me feel like that. Keats would say back, you haven't read enough yet then. Keep reading and find the book that does that for you. His second word picture is even more interesting. He says he felt like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Now, two things we want to say about this for your notes. One, Keats got his history wrong. Okay? Please forgive. Keats got his history wrong. He should have said Balboa, and instead he said Cortez. Okay? So that's the first thing we should say. Well, who is this Balboa cat? Really fascinating explorer. He ends up on the eastern side of South America. Right? He's got his guys with him, and their goal is to traverse South America. The only problem is no Europeans done this, so they got no map. So they actually don't know where they're going other than heading constantly west. So they walk, and they walk, and they walk. He reports in his journals that for several weeks at a time, it's midnight all day long because they're walking under a canopy of forest trees that are so dense you never can see light of the sky or the sun. That's how thick the forest is. All kinds of strange things happen on their walk. People start getting sick and dying. Of course, his men start to believe this is an ill-fated mission. Let's turn around and go back. A couple of times they try to mutiny on him, as a matter of fact. But then after months of walking, you know how far it is across South America, finally after months of walking, one of his scouts looks out through the trees and sees blue right in front of them, not up. Calls them all that. They all come running up, and all of a sudden as they step out of the trees, they're on a mountain called Darien. And for the first time, those eyes see the Pacific Ocean. Of course, here's the thing. They weren't altogether sure what was there on the other side. They didn't know what they were looking at. It was the greatest ocean in the world, the Pacific Ocean. An ocean that we know today to traverse, of course, as we said with Rime of the Ancient Mariner, flying at 600 miles an hour. You're still over this body of water for 14, 15, 16 hours, right? This is a huge ocean. Can you imagine the feeling, right, of looking out onto that body of water for the very first time? Now write that one down. What would that feel like? After all of the months and months of walking and struggle, finally, there it is in front of you. Wow, what's that like? What feeling do you have there? And, right, a feeling of relief, good. A feeling of accomplishment. See, here's the thing Keats will say about reading. Sometimes learning how to read is learning how to feel a sense of accomplishment. Can we say it, hello, without insult? Can we say it out loud? It's like learning to read a poem like this. Remember what it was like when I read Tintern Abbey to you for the first time? And your sense was, got no idea what this is about. Then we work through it. Then you can have that sense of accomplishment. Think about how that idea even works with this poem, where we say, let's read it. A number of us go, I got no clue what it's about. We work through it, and now you kind of understand it. Let's jump to 3B. This is an interesting question. It's going to be a fun one for some of you, and it's going to be an insult to others of you, but that's all right. Let's try it anyway. At 3B, I challenge you to write down one book you've ever read which even comes close to the two feelings that he describes, seeing a new planet or seeing the ocean for the very first time? Do you have a single book in your whole life that you've ever read that you would qualify as being a really great read? Maybe it was assigned, maybe it wasn't assigned, maybe you stumbled across it. For those of you who can't do that with a book, Keats would say, your life is more shallow because of that. You haven't traveled enough. But let's keep going because we live in a different time, don't we? And maybe we don't read as much as we watch. So let's say it this way. You can have the same feeling about a great film. Is there a film that you've ever watched? Go ahead and write that down at 3B. Is there a movie that you've watched that when you came out of it, you were so blown away that you literally had to go back the next day and see the movie a second time? And then when it came out on DVD or the ability to download on Netflix, you wanted to watch it again. Maybe another way to ask this is, what is the film you've seen the most in your life and why? I'm guessing it's not because it was torture. I'm guessing it's because you liked it in some way. And then about that film, try to remember the first time you saw it, the very first time you experienced it. Were any of these feelings acquainted with that one, associated with that experience? And some of you will maybe say, yeah, that kind of makes sense to me, to have an experience like that. Of course, we could go on. For maybe some of you, it's watching a performance. Maybe for some of you, it's listening to a song, right? A song or a performance of a song that kind of blows you away when it happens the first time and you come back to it. For example, can you jot down in your notes at 3B your favorite song? And the reason I'm going to challenge you to maybe do this is to remember the very first time you heard it. Now that's interesting. Can you even remember the first time you heard that favorite song? I have students that will report two things. One, I can't remember. I know this is my favorite song. It's the song I love. If you give me the option of only one song on my playlist, that's the one I go to. But I can't remember the very first time I heard it. That's what some seniors will report. Other seniors will say something fascinating. I got to be honest, the first time I heard it, I didn't like it. And it only became my favorite song after the fact, after I listened to it over and over again. Of course, this is interesting. I have students that will say, if I read it once, I'm done. Why do I need to read it a second time? But that is not the way you approach listening to the music you love, right? You listen to a song more than one time. I mean, it's not like you go out and buy the music or download it, listen to it once and then get rid of it, throw it away if you like it. Why do you keep listening to it? Are you crazy? Because I like it. Why do you watch the same movie that you like over and over again? See, you enjoy it. Keats will say, if you learn how to read, you can have the same kind of joy from reading. Now, that's a subject of some debate, I suppose. You can jot down at 3B whether you agree with Keats or not on this count. Do you think that, in fact, he's on to something here with this notion of traveling as reading? Can you go places through reading? Do you think people like to read today the way they used to? Why do you think that's changed? I mean, think about it. You're seniors. Dude, you have spent 12 years learning how to read. Why do you think they spend so much time wanting you to learn that skill set? If you're reporting, nobody really does it much anymore. Why? And are you ready for this? This is a scary one. Right now, I can go into any third grade classroom in Worland, walk in and walk up to the teacher and say, show me your red group readers. Show me your blue group readers. And I can predict in third grade who's going to write the highest ACT scores. In third grade. I can already predict that. By the way, I'm not saying me. I'm saying anybody that does the research that we do in this area. We know already by third grade, the way you read will determine how good a score you get on the ACT and your educational opportunities down the line, which means what? You got it. I can predict who's going to make the money out of third grade, and it all has to do with who can read. Whoa. How would you like to be a third grade teacher and know that stat? Yeah. How would you like to be a parent of a kid who's in the blue group? Who knows that stat? Oh. Right? And for some of you, you will be parents someday. That'll be an interesting question. What books will you read to your kid at the park while you're swinging them? John Milton's Paradise Lost is the absolute correct answer. Well done, Garza. That along with which you could chew in a box, which you could chew